civilians, giving them worthless Confederate scrip in exchange. They also seized free blacks and sent them south into slavery. My friends, a Southern officer asked the frightened inhabitants of one Pennsylvania town, "How do you like this way of our coming back into the Union?"
So did you catch that? They kidnapped free people and sent them into slavery. If there's any doubt what this war is being fought about, and after the war there's going to be a lot of garbage, states' rights and all this stuff. No. The war was about slavery, and this proves it. Also, when people try to glamorize Lee, it's kind of a big deal, especially when they were talking about his statues. Wait a second. What do you order?
It was in the morrow's battle, fast rained the shot and shell. I was standing close beside him, and I saw him when he fell. So I took him in my arm and laid him on the grass. It was going against orders, but they'd think it let it pass. 'Twas a mini ball that struck him. It entered at his side, but we didn't think it fatal till this morning, but he died.
Yeah, they used her dad's poems, kind of tying these together.
The greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere began as a clash over shoes. At dawn on July 1st, a Confederate infantry officer led his men toward the little crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, within view of a Lutheran seminary whose high cupola offered a fine prospect of the surrounding farms and rolling hills. There was rumored to be a supply of shoes at Gettysburg, and the footsore rebels were there to commandeer them. The South came in from the North that day, and the North came in from the South. On the outskirts of town, the Confederates ran headlong into General John Buford's Union cavalry. While both sides sent couriers pounding off for reinforcements, Buford tried desperately to hold his ground. But the Confederates finally overwhelmed him and pushed the Union forces back toward town.
People were running here and there, screaming that the town would be shelled. No one knew where to go or what to do. My husband went to the garden and picked a mess of beans, for he declared the rebels should not have one. Sally Broadhead.
Every Confederate and Union division in the area now converged on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. By mid-afternoon, Confederate troops occupied Gettysburg, and Union forces had been driven back south of the town. There, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock managed to rally the fleeing troops into defensive positions on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge. A sign...
So tell you real quick about this. So on that first day, there was actually much bigger fight than they showed in the video, but they just had so much happen in the next 2 days. And the first couple Union corps, about 10,000 men each that arrived, were just overwhelmed by numbers. They were too far away. And the second corps that arrived were the Dutchmen. Remember I told you about that corps of Germans, immigrants at Chancellorsville? It just happened to be the same corps, the same one that was routed. And the same thing happened. They got outflanked and ran. So it looked like another victory, like another Confederate victory. But General Meade vowed to stand and fight.
Near the cemetery's gateway read, "All persons found using firearms in these grounds will be prosecuted with the utmost rigor of the law." During the battle, the artist Alfred Woad sketched the action, sending his drawings back to New York for engraving. Meanwhile, Sam Wilkeson of the New York Times filed dispatches sitting next to the fresh grave of his son.
His son was a Union soldier.
Lee arrived in the middle of the afternoon, set up headquarters, and urged Ewell to renew the attack before nightfall. Ewell chose not to. His men needed rest. By the end of the day, the Union Army held the high ground. Rather than attack it headlong, Confederate General Longstreet wanted to swing around the Union position and take a stand between Meade's army and Washington. Then let the Union attack.
Like Fredericksburg.
Without knowing the enemy's strength, Lee overruled Longstreet. No, said Lee, I'm going to whip them here, or they are going to whip me.
So I'm going to fast forward just a little bit. That was the first day. He decided to leave.
Through the night, the two armies continued to gather. After a 35-mile all-night march, Union General John Sedgwick arrived with his 6th Corps. By morning, 65,000 Confederates faced 85,000 Federal troops commanded by General George Meade. Hills overlooked the Federal position at either end. To the north on the Union right, Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. To the south, the Big and Little Round Tops.
Little Round Top right here was the key to the line. This mountain right here, because the Confederates can get there, they can swing around, threaten the rear, cause panic, or shoot right down the line. Yeah.
Is that the answer to number 5?
Yeah, Little Round Top. The key to the line. And it also said, you notice only 85,000 Union soldiers. And I've always had given you bigger numbers. Remember I told you after the first battle of Bull Run, they had 90-day enlistments and they changed it to 2-year enlistments? Well, they ended at the end of May. And the Union Army lost 30,000 men. Men said, I'm not going to re-enlist. And so Meade all of a sudden was down all these men. This was relatively close in numbers, and it could turn either way. If the Union Army loses here badly, this could be the war and the end of the United States. That's Little Round Top.
Lee wanted them taken. Meade was no less determined to hold his ground.
All commanders are authorized to order the instant death of any soldier who fails in his duty at this hour.
Okay,
It took Longstreet all morning and most of the afternoon to shift 2 divisions into position for the assault on the Round Tops. Assigned to hold the Union position was General Dan Sickles, a turbulent ex-Tammany Hall politician best known before the war for having shot and killed his wife's lover. Now Sickles disobeyed orders and marched his men further out from Little Round Top, to the Devil's Den, the wheat field, and into the peach orchard beyond. He was half a mile in front of the Union line on a flat, exposed position that left the Round Tops completely undefended.
The rest of the army was amazed. Someone said he stuck out like a sore thumb. And I think it was Hancock who saw him go out, and he said, wait a while, you'll see him tumbling back. And of course it did.
Sickles marched out against orders, because it looked like a better position, but it just exposed the entire flank. Little Round Top's unprotected. And Meade ordered him to retreat. And Sickles was reluctantly going to do it. And then just at that moment, the Confederates attacked. It's too late.
The Confederates finally attacked at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As they swept forward, the 15th Alabama Regiment scrambled up Big Round Top. From there, well above the fighting, Colonel William C. Oates saw his chance. Little Round Top was completely undefended. From that position, Oates said, he could blow the whole Union Army apart.
Within half an hour, I could convert Little Round Top into a Gibraltar that I could hold against 10 times the number of men that I had.
Meanwhile, Meade dispatched General G.K. Warren to the summit. He immediately saw the danger. Only a handful of signalmen held the hill. Oates' Confederates were moving down and around the Union left. Warren sent at once for reinforcements. 4 Union regiments raced up Little Round Top.
In a moment, all was excitement. Every soldier seemed to understand the situation and to be inspired by its danger. Away we went, under the terrible artillery fire. Shells were exploding on every side. But our men appeared to be as cool and deliberate in their movements as if they had been forming a line upon the parade ground in camp. Up the steep hillside, we ran and reached the crest.
At the extreme left of the Union line now was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine.
Chamberlain.
Oates' Alabamians were already moving between the two hills. Chamberlain's orders were to hold that ground at all costs.
So there's Chamberlain, his 20th Maine, and that's the flank. And the Confederates kind of have him outflanked, but it's really rugged. Just massive granite, or these granite boulders are everywhere. It's really a weird looking place. And it's a race, and the Union beat them just by a little bit. So Chamberlain's right there. It's this picture just to the right of the clock. He's all over Gettysburg.
Imagine, if you can, 9 small companies of infantry, numbering perhaps 300 men, in the form of a right angle, on the extreme flank of an army of 80,000 men, put there to hold the key of the entire position against a force at least 10 times their number. Stand firm, you boys from Maine. For not once in a century are men permitted to bear such responsibilities for freedom and justice, for God and humanity, as are now placed upon you.
So that's where they lined up. And after the fighting there, the men stacked rocks up just in case. And then they later put with mortar and put that down. And so that's what it looks like today. That's the exact line where the 20th Maine was.
360 Maine men now took cover behind boulders. They had less than 10 minutes to spare. At the last possible moment, Chamberlain sent his Company B across the hollow between the hills to bolster his left flank. Before they were in place, Oates' Confederates charged up the slope. Chamberlain assumed Company B had been wiped out. He could not afford the loss. The Maine men opened fire into the charging rebels. Oates' men staggered but regrouped and came at them again.
The line had broken because of the timber in the first fire of the hidden Federals. A long line of us went down, 3 of us close together. There was a sharp electric pain in the lower part of the body, and then a sinking sensation to the earth. And falling, all things growing dark. The one and last ideas passing through the mind was, this is the last of Earth. Private W.C. Ward, 4th Alabama.
The enemy was pouring a terrible fire upon us, his superior forces giving him a great advantage. The air seemed to be alive with lead. The lines at times were so near each other that the hostile gun barrels almost touched.
The Southerners drove the Maine men from their positions 5 times. 5 times they fought their way back again. Saplings were gnawed in 2 by bullets.
At times I saw around me more of the enemy than of my own men. Gaps, opening, swallowing, closing again. Squads of stalwart men who would cut their way through us, disappearing, as if translated. All around, a strange mingled roar.
In an hour and a half, a third of Chamberlain's men fell. Sounds of battle now increased behind the 20th Maine. Chamberlain assumed Little Round Top was being surrounded.
Our ammunition is nearly all gone, and we are using the cartridges from the boxes of our wounded comrades. A critical moment has arrived, and we can remain as we are no longer. We must advance or retreat. It must not be the latter. But how can it be the former?
Chamberlain's only choice was to attack, and now he conjured up an unlikely textbook maneuver. With his men almost out of ammunition, he ordered them to fix bayonets. Then, while the right of his line held straight, he had his left plunge down the hillside, all the while wheeling to the right, like a great gate upon a post, an eyewitness said.
This is a risky move, not ammunition. If you put your bayonet in your musket, these are all muzzle-loading muskets. So you have to be able to put the cartridge in and then tap it down with a ramrod. With a bayonet in, it's really hard to load your musket. So this is an all or nothing. Fixing bayonets and charging, this is it. If it fails, their flank is turning. Who knows how history will change? A very risky move. Gutsy.
The Confederates were taken completely by surprise. Those in the front ranks dropped their weapons. Those behind turned and ran.
Many of the enemy's first line threw down their arms and surrendered. An officer fired his pistol at my head with one hand, while he handed me his sword with the other.
The Confederates had gone only a few paces when from their left came a second horrifying surprise. Chamberlain's missing Company B, which had found protection behind a stone wall, now rose and fired.
While one man was shot in the face, his right-hand comrade was shot in the side or back. Some were struck simultaneously from 2 or 3 balls from different directions. Colonel William C. Oates.
Oates' men wavered, broke, and ran for their lives.
My dead and wounded were then nearly as great in number as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks. The ground was soaked with blood.
Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's scanty force captured 400 Confederates. Little Round Top held.
Pretty amazing.
The regiment we fought and captured was a 15th Alabama. They said they never were whipped before and never wanted to meet the 20th of Maine again. Corporal William T. Livermore.
Yes.
On the slopes of Little Round Top, farmers from Talladega, Alabama had fought fishermen from Presque Isle, Maine. The two towns were each 650 miles from Gettysburg, which lay almost exactly on a direct line between them. Throughout the day's fighting, Colonel A.S. Fremantle, a British observer traveling with Lee, was surprised to hear the sound of a Confederate band playing polkas and waltzes amidst the hissing and bursting of the shells. But far out in front of the Union lines, General Sickles and his men were in desperate trouble. The rebels were closing in from 3 sides. Confederate shells tore branches from the peach trees and bounded among the men.
The hoarse and indistinguishable orders of commanding officers, the screaming and bursting of shells, canister and shrapnel as they tore through the struggling masses of humanity, the death screams of wounded animals, the groans of their human companions, wounded and dying and trampling underfoot by hurrying batteries, riderless horses in the moving lines of battle. A perfect hell on earth, never perhaps to be equaled, certainly not to be surpassed, nor ever to be forgotten in a man's lifetime. It has never been effaced from my memory day or night for 50 years. Private Robert H. Carter, 22nd Massachusetts.
The balls were whizzing so thick, a Texan remembered, that it looked like a man could hold out a hat and catch it full.
I was within a few feet of General Sickles when he received the wound by which he lost his leg. A terrific explosion seemed to shake the very earth, instantly followed by another. I noticed that his pants and drawers at the knee were torn clear off to the leg, which was swinging loose. He was carried from the field, coolly smoking a cigar.
Yeah, they were a different breed back then. And he's fucked. And they preserved his leg in a jar at the U.S. Army Hospital, now called Bethesda Military Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. And Sickles would be elected to Congress to go visit his leg almost every week. And if you want to, you can too visit his leg. Still in the jar, still there.
Sickles' men counterattacked, fell back, held, pushed the Confederates back, then retreated again through places still remembered for the ferocity of the fighting that happened there. the wheat field, the slaughter pen, Devil's Den, the Valley of Death. Finally, the fighting subsided. Of the 262 in one Minnesota regiment, only 47 survived unhurt. 82% had fallen in less than 5 minutes. No Union.
So the reason it happened like this, and remember I told you at Antietam, all those men were killed or wounded, and the photographers came up and took pictures? Well, they made so much money after Brady did that, a whole horde of them, and they started dragging bodies around to get more dramatic shots. So it's just awful. This is 2 or 3 days after the battle. So think about men skinny as a rail, but then they're bloody in a hot July. Think about middle of July. Well, the first Massachusetts, or the first Minnesota, were reinforcements marching to the front. And what happened was on the front, General Hancock was shifting Union forces over to stop the Confederate attack. And he moved some forces over and left a hole. And before reinforcements could come, bad luck for the Union, the Confederates were attacking right there, about 3,000 men. Hancock rode to the reinforcements who were marching along basically a trail in column of 2, just a long line for marching. They weren't ready to fight. They weren't in their line to fight. But he rode up, ordered fixed bayonets, charge. So they just charged like that, 2 long columns of men into the Confederates. Stop it. In 5 minutes, that's why over 80% went down. At that spot, there is a memorial that Minnesota put up. And I'll show you this next week when I'll show you the slide, finish up more of the slides. There's a man charging with his bayonet. Most of them are pretty gaudy. The statue's there, every state put up a statue. But that one's pretty uncool.
Union regiment in the war suffered greater casualties. Company F of the 6th North Carolina lost 100%.
Dear Father, finally I came to poor Albert lying on the ground, wounded under the left eye. He had also had a ball shot through his left leg. I had no one to help me bear him from the field. I then called the captain of another company to assist me, and we bore Albert 600 yards through a dense swamp, all bleeding and sore with pain, before we could find any of the ambulance corps to bear him off to the hospital. Taking him in my arms, I assisted him in the stretcher. Dropping a tear of grief upon his bleeding face, I bade him goodbye. Charles Batchelor.
So this is foreshadowing. This is brother. Unions.
Last night, I wanted so to live. I seemed so young to go. Last week I passed my birthday. I was just 19, When I thought of all I'd planned to do, it seemed so hard to die. But now I pray to God for grace, and all my cares have gone by. And here his voice grew weaker as he partly raised his head and whispered, "Goodbye, Mother." And your soldier boy was dead.
Who is victorious or with whom the advantage rests, no one here can tell. Some think the rebels were defeated, as there's been no boasting as on yesterday, and they look uneasy and by no means exultant. I fear we are too hopeful. We shall see tomorrow. Sally Broadhead.
All I knew it was
As the sun set, the Union left and right still held. Lee was sure an all-out Confederate attack on the center the next day would work.
When the second day's battle was over, General Lee pronounced it a success. But we had accomplished little toward victorious results. General James Longstreet. The first day's fighting was so encouraging. And the second day's fighting, he came within an inch of doing it. And by that time, Longstreet said Lee's blood was up. And Longstreet said when his blood was up, there was no stopping him. Longstreet tried to stop him, and Lee said, "No, he's there. I'm in the enemy, and I'm going to strike him."
General Longstreet, I think, had good reasons to worry about attacking the Union position at Gettysburg. after all, was his corps at Fredericksburg that mowed down the Union troops in front of the stone wall. He could realize what the rifled musket could do, held in the hands of determined troops.
The next day was Pickett's charge.
Lee, by the summer of 1863, had come to believe that he was invincible, and so was the Army of Northern Virginia. The record would almost invite that when you see how they had pummeled one Union general after another and had defeated, or at least fought to a draw, the Army of the Potomac almost in every battle up to that point. And Lee really did think that if he asked his boys to do something, they would do it, that they would do anything. He had come by Gettysburg then to believe in his invincibility and that of his men. And it
Going faster. He thought he was invincible. You can kind of understand.
The third day began badly for Lee. Ewell's men were driven back from Culp's Hill. Jeb Stuart was supposed to get behind the Federals and attack them from the rear. But Union cavalry stopped and held him, thanks in part to a series of reckless charges led by 23-year-old General George Armstrong Custer. Everything now depended on Longstreet's attack on the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. Meade saw it coming and was ready for him. The man Lee chose to lead the assault was dashing, perfumed General George E. Pickett, who had never before taken his division into combat.
It was an incredible mistake, and there's scarcely a trained soldier who didn't know it was a mistake at the time it was done, except possibly Pickett himself, who was very happy at a chance for glory. But every man who looked out over that field, whether it's a sergeant or a lieutenant general, saw that it was a desperate endeavor, and I'm sure knew that it should not have been made.
Pickett's men filed into the woods west of the Emmetsburg Road and waited in the stifling heat. To relieve the tension, some of the men pelted each other with green apples.
They knew what they were going to do, but they had to wait. And while they were waiting, formed and ready to move out, they were in defilade among brush and things. And a rabbit jumped out of the bushes and took off rearward. And one of the soldiers looked after him and hollered, "Run, old hare. If I was old hare, I'd run too." Sure, it wasn't all valor.
You like this story.
Exactly at 1 o'clock, a giant artillery barrage intended to soften up the Union defenses before the attack began with a deafening explosion. Meade had just left his commanders finishing their lunch. As an orderly served them butter, a shell tore the man in two.
The storm broke upon us so suddenly that numbers of soldiers and officers who leaped from their tents or lazy siestas on the grass were stricken in their rising with mortal wounds and died, some with cigars clamped between their teeth, some with pieces of food in their fingers.
The flying iron and pieces of stone struck some men down in every direction. About 30 men of our brigade were killed or wounded. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
To keep up his men's courage, General Winfield Scott Hancock rode up and down the line without flinching at the screaming shells. A brigadier urged him to take cover. Hancock refused. "There are times," he answered, "when a corps commander's life does not count." Union artillery began to fire back.
We sat and heard in silence. What other expression had we that was not mean for such an awful universe of battle? All in the rear of the crest for 1,000 yards was the field of the shell's blind fury. Ambulances passing down the Tarrytown Road with wounded men were struck. The hospitals were riddled. Frank Haskell.
Suddenly, the Union guns fell silent. to conserve ammunition for the attack Meade was sure was coming, and to lure the enemy out into the open fields. It worked. At about 2 o'clock, Pickett asked if his men should go forward. Longstreet, convinced the charge was folly, unable to bring himself to speak, only nodded.
If you stop to think about it, it would have been much harder not to go than to go. It would have taken a great deal of courage to say, Marse Robert, I ain't going. Nobody's got that much courage.
Now Pickett gave the order. Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia. At 3 o'clock, 3 divisions, 13,000 men, started out of the woods toward the stone wall, a mile and a half away, at a brisk, steady pace, covering about 100 yards a minute. They were silent as they marched, forbidden this time to fire, or even to give the rebel yell, until they were on top of the enemy.
You're exhausted. Yeah, it's over a mile.
More than half a...
So it's over a mile, gradually going uphill, and the Union forces are on a ridge behind a stone wall. Stone wall's about, okay, my waist high. And there's a few fences. And so they're going to march this whole way exposed. This should remind you of another battle we talked about the other day. And the shells, when the Confederates attacked, the shells went over the front line trying to hit the rear. So the Union forces in front were basically not hit at all. So they're just waiting. Oh, there's this great big auditorium at Gettysburg at the Interpretive Center, massive auditorium. And they have this huge kind of circular room with high round walls. And this is the painting on it. So the painting's massive. And you sit in this big auditorium and it kind of turns around. And so it covers the whole battle. So this is the beginning that kind of goes step by step. And it's one of those, to be honest with you, I heard about this, it's called Cyclodrome. And I thought it's going to be hokey, you know, silly, touristy thing. It's amazing. They really did a good job. I know it's over the last few years they've been reconditioning it, but if you ever get a chance, go or go back, I would highly recommend it. It's really cool.
Mile their front extends, man touching man, rank pressing rank. The red flags wave, their horsemen gallop up and down. The arms of 13,000 men, barrel and bayonet, gleam in the sun. A sloping forest of flashing steel. Right on they move, as with one soul. None on that crest now need be told. The enemy is advancing. Every eye could see his legions, an overwhelming, resistless tide, an ocean of armed men sweeping upon us. All was orderly and still upon our crest, no noise and no confusion. General Gibbon rode down the lines, cool and calm, and in an unimpassioned voice, he said to the men, "Do not hurry, men, and fire too fast. Let them come up close before you fire, and then aim slow."
Gibbon would be at Fort Missoula.
It was, a Union colonel recalled, the most beautiful thing I ever saw. Suddenly, the Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top opened fire, and a great moan went up from the Confederate line. We could not help hitting them at every shot, a Federal officer recalled. As many as 10 men at a time were destroyed by a single bursting shell. A Confederate lieutenant cried out to his men, "Home, boys, home. Remember, home is over beyond those hills." The waiting Union troops began chanting, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." When the first Southerners came within 200 yards, Union General Alexander Hayes told his men to fire. 11 cannon and 1,700 muskets went off at once. Entire regiments disappeared.
The rebel lines were at once enveloped in a dense cloud of dust. Arms, heads, blankets, guns, and knapsacks were tossed into the clear air.
Still, the Confederates came on. They reached the Union line at one place only, a crook in the stone wall known as the Angle.
Seconds are centuries, minutes, ages. Men fire into each other's faces not 5 feet apart. There are bayonet thrusts, saber strokes, pistol shots. Men going down on their hands and knees, spinning round like tops, throwing out their arms, gulping blood, falling, legless, armless, headless. There are ghastly heaps of dead men.
Foot to foot, body to body, and man to man, they struggled and pushed and strived and killed. The mass of wounded and heaps of dead tangled their feet. And underneath the trampling mass, wounded men who could no longer stand fought, drowned in sweat, black with powder, red with blood.
The Confederates were led by General Lewis A. Armstead. He stepped over the wall waving his hat on his sword and seized a Union battery before he was shot down.
Let me explain that really quick. And so, sorry, I'm trying to get that. Okay, so that's actually not him. Another general was accused of bravery, so he was going to ride at the front of his command on his horse, general named Buckner, and he was killed. But it's such a dramatic thing. So he put his hat on the sword so they could see it through the black powder. Armistead got to the line, was mortally wounded. His best friend in the old army, as they called it before the war, was Hancock, who was the commander of the Union Center. And Armistead knew his friend would be holding there. You know, they both knew it, even though they're on opposing sides. Best friends. Armistead is horribly wounded, dying. And his last words to men around him, as literally the chaos is going around him, is that his last words were, "What of Hancock?" And 30 yards away, you could pace it. They have the marks where that happened. Hancock, a shell exploded nearby, and he was horribly wounded. Fell off his horse. It looked like he was dead because he was hit in the gut. And his last words before he passed out was, "Is Armistead here?" And they were just 30 yards apart. If it wasn't for the massive chaos, they could see each other. Gives you an idea, you know, this is a civil war. Best friends fighting each other. Also how small the army was. Hancock would live and do more. We'll come back to him, but he's never the same.
All the Confederates who breached the wall were killed or captured. The Union line held. Pickett's charge had failed. Lee's army would never again penetrate so far into Northern Territory.
Cheer after cheer rose from the triumphant boys in blue, echoing from Round Top, from Cemetery Hill, resounding in the vale below, making the very heavens throb. Private Jesse Young.
As the rebels staggered back, Lee rode out to meet them. "All this has been my fault," he told them.
Probably his finest hour was after the repulse of Pickett's charge. He walked out into the field, met the men retreating, and said, "It is all my fault." And he told them that. He wrote to the government, to Jefferson Davis, and said, "It was all my fault. I asked more of men than should have been asked of them."
Pickett was horrified. When told to rally his division for a possible Union counterattack, Pickett answered, "General Lee, I have no division now." Pickett never forgave Lee. Years later, he said, That old man had my division slaughtered.
Gettysburg was the price the South paid for having R.E. Lee. That was the mistake he made, the mistake of all mistakes.
I want to get to the end of the battle. Yeah, they drug the bodies out so they get the more morbid shots. And they would do this for the rest of the war. What people will do for a little bit of money. So I want to get through Gettysburg. And it's always one of the things I kind of question myself, because we have so much time, you know, lots of time. Is this worth showing? And I think so. I believe it is. But also considering what just happened on Wednesday, I think it's even more important.
Yeah. So
they do a good job. A little, you know, there's some things they do differently, of course. I think another Civil War series might be great at some good documentaries to do it again. I should add, if you like